Hello, I'm Robin Ince and I am at CERN, and this is the synchrocyclotron, which we'll probably tell you about more later on. In fact, I was just thinking, I've got some badges that are very suitable to being at CERN because I've got there, that's Nick Cave, who of course wrote the Higgs Boson blues, and actually I'm wearing from Australia the Deep Space Network badge because I was lucky enough at the end of 2022 to go to the Deep Space Network. And I was thinking about just that fascinating thing where the Deep Space Network is looking out and out and out and out, and in CERN, from this, the first project, and then many of the other projects we're going to be looking at as well in the colliders, they are about looking in and in and in and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and both those frames of reference, of course, are so incredibly important for us to understand our place in the universe, why things in the universe. And I was, in fact, when I woke up this morning, because CERN to me is almost mythological, because I've worked with so many scientists who've worked here, and I've imagined it so many times. And I didn't imagine it would be such a short drive from an airport hotel, either in the middle of somehow you imagine that, though some of it is in the middle of nowhere, though of course, as we know, nowhere is nowhere. But it is just, to arrive at 8:45 on a Friday morning, to see a film explaining the work here, to see on the screen Edith Piaf and Albert Camus as well, to contextualise 1949, and then to think about that in some ways, when I woke up, I thought CERN is almost the Stonehenge of the 20th and 21st century. I was thinking of someone in 10,000 years' time, perhaps humans, perhaps even, who knows, visiting the planet, and what they would make of this enormous circle, and what this circle was trying to help. Because if Stonehenge, and we don't know, or even the stones of Callaniche, if those things were there in some way to measure the sky, to judge the sky, and they were these wonderful circles that now we revere. And here are these wonderful loops, again, which are also helping us understand not merely the small, but everything that is around us. So I think there's going to be quite a few adventures. Also, hopefully, because Tesla obviously gets mentioned, we might talk about Tesla's first experiment, which was gluing the thorax of living beetles onto a little treadmill to power a machine. So today is the first day of, going in and seeing basically the Atlas experiment, seeing that, and I cannot deny that there are certain moments in my life where, that the overwhelming beauty of something that you've heard of, something you've seen photographs of, whatever it might be, and it suddenly overwhelms you when you see its reality. And the memory I think of that experience was going around a corner on a road and then suddenly just seeing the Grand Canyon, right? And you saw the Grand Canyon, and however many expectations I'd had of its magnitude, seeing it for real, the excitement, the dopamine hit, whatever it might be, was just overwhelming. The first time that I went to Jodrell Bank and I saw the Lovell telescope as I went round the corner, I thought, here again is something that I've seen so many times in Doctor Who, in the stories of Alan Garner, but now I see it for real. And today, going down in those lifts, going down nearly 100 meters, walking through that door, and then just seeing an image that I'd seen so many times of Atlas was overwhelming and beautiful. Right, this is the Atlas experiment. I suppose in one way, to me, one of the most famous images of what happens in CERN. One of the ones that went before, I was talking about this kind of mythic quality. Just walking through, there was just a smile came across my face because I kind of knew it was enormous, and it's no more enormous than I thought it would be. But its enormity has still surprised me, even though I knew it was. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's two me's. There's me that's gone, oh yeah, that's about the size of it, and there's me that's going, that is the size of it. Right, I was just saying that my first reaction to this, that it's overwhelming however much I've seen this in images, and I was saying it is like, there's so many other certain things, well not so many, there's a few other things where your stomach just moves. And I just smiled. When I went through the door, I was just like, that's it. And so, first of all, your reaction when you're sometimes maybe detached from the science, but still attached to the enormity of this project.
I still feel lucky every time I get to come underground. that I get to work here and I get to see this detector, and I get to come underground quite a bit now, so I get to see it from every different angle, and so I'm always still surprised when I see a new bit of it and I'm like, oh, it still looks really cool.
Well, I mean, John, you've obviously, we did a link up Hammersmith Apollo when it was December, would that be December 2011, 2012?
I think it was 11 and 12, we did two.
Yeah,
2011
we did this bit, because it was the first time there'd been a result that really suggested definitely you were going to come across, and it was a lot quicker. And of course, what happened was all the technology we had to talk about this remarkable technology didn't work. Yep. But first of all, the speed that this got results. This is something that should not be, underestimated, should it?
Especially given that, if you remember, it didn't work to design at first, so we were running at kind of half the energy, and we still managed to get the result out quickly. Which was, I mean, some of that was luck, right? I mean, there's two ways an experiment can quite succeed or fail. One is if it doesn't do what it was designed to do, and two is if nature is unkind and actually the results you hoped aren't actually there. And we were lucky on both. Well, we were lucky on the nature thing, and a lot of hard work delivered on the other one, I would say.
Yeah.
And luck, let's be honest, there's luck involved in anything like this, but there's a lot of work to make sure it happens as well. Yeah.
Well, sorry, John.
No, I would say I don't come down here that often either. Right? When I used to, when it was starting, because I was doing lots of VIP tours like you, but I'm not doing any more. But what I do most of the time now with my students as well in London mostly is analyse the data from this, and it's really salutary to come down and look at those cables. How would you know if someone had plugged the wrong cable into the wrong thing? And knowing that this data is real, that it's not a theoretical exercise, it's this that means that it's connected to the actual real physical universe, and with all the problems that can bring with it and all the reality that brings to it. It's really important to do that. And so I almost don't trust my PhD students until at least they've seen this and they've done some work on it. Even though that's not mainly what their intellectual contribution is likely to be, because it's built now. But nevertheless, you've got to know where the data comes from, otherwise you'll make mistakes.
Yeah, it's good when people come and get to see it in person. My favorite thing is when I take people on tours and that noise they make when they get at the end, because usually we have people the floor above and they get through the tunnel, and then it's just like you were saying, that just wow, or like just a sort of escape of enthusiasm when they see the detector for the first time. And I've been quite lucky during my career because I did my PhD on the detector itself. So I was upgrading the very inner part of the detector. So I really I spent my time in the clean room, I got to have my hands on things, and now that's in the center of the detector. So every time I come and see it, I'm like, my bit's in there.
Well, it was thinking again about the delayed gratification of science. This is what I think is beautiful about being somewhere like CERN, and thinking the fact that in my mind there is a little thing that I run through, imagining many, many years ago when Peter Higgs came up with the idea. And some people said, oh, Peter, that is a good idea. That is a very, very good idea. Do you know what we're going to do, Peter, actually? We think that is such a good idea that we are going to start digging underneath Switzerland. And some of France as well. And then eventually when we've got something, I don't know, about 29 kilometres round, something like that, we're going to create machines which are currently almost beyond the human imagination. And then eventually we're going to send around bundles of particles at speeds near that of light. I hope you're right. And it's like the pressure of that. And I've imagined Peter Higgs the next day looking again and going, oh, I forgot to carry the two. They've started digging. I'm leaving, right?
So we're at the very outer edge of the ATLAS experiment. So what we can see right now is the large muon wheel. So the muons are the heavier cousins of electrons. And so when the LHC collisions happen in the very center of our detector, which is over in that direction, so the proton bunches collide. New particles are created like the Higgs boson. But they don't last for very long, and so they very quickly change into other particles like electrons or muons or taus or anything, or quarks, and they come out in all directions. And by the edge of our detector, the only two particles that we know of so far that make it out this far are muons and neutrinos. And we just can't measure neutrinos in our detector. We do have a new fancy little machine down this way that's trying to detect neutrinos. Yeah, just a few. But really the muons are the ones that make it all the way out. But because they're heavier than electrons, they travel through our whole detector. They're really nice for measuring So we can measure them in multiple parts, but they're also very good for data selection. So we can't keep all the data that we create in those collisions. We have to be very selective. And so some of the parts of this detector that we're looking at right now is for that data selection purpose. But again, as you were saying, I think being able to see it in person is that link between the tangible and then the real aspect of getting the data, analysing it and being able to get these new results.
And the pop-up book.
Yes.
The nearest I've got to seeing CERN was, I remember when they brought out the LHC pop-up book. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And I remember being given it, I think, after doing an event for some physicists, and I opened it up, and it didn't quite open properly, and you had to kind of nudge the tabs to get it in the right place. So it felt very scientific. It felt like, we gave it a go, it doesn't quite work on the first attempt, keep putting your fingers into it, eventually it'll be the right shape, and it was.
This detector is too big to have been constructed above ground and then to be lowered down. So this cavern actually already existed from the time of LEP, but we did expand it for the LHC and for Atlas. But the way that this detector was constructed is we use these shafts up here. So if you look right up, we have 3 of these shafts throughout the cavern, and the detector was constructed in smaller pieces and then lowered down like you would make a ship in a bottle, and then it was constructed in place. So if we want to, when we're finished with it in 25 years, then we're going to have to take it apart again and raise it up back through those shafts.
Well, I just filled a hole in it.
Or just, yeah.
See, what a great bit of, the archaeology for whatever might exist in 20,000 years' time.
Yeah.
To dig down and say, you won't believe what we've just found. What on earth were they thinking? Because there's that possibility as well, isn't there?
Or, oh my goodness, they had proton
colliders.
But
I love thinking about the fact that the reason we exist is the disorder of the universe. There was a point where the universe was very, very ordered, very, very compact. And now the entropy has begun, and there's a period of time in which that entropy, that disorder, leads to life and curious life. And I think that is something truly, again, something that we must savor. I mean, I remember talking to another astronomer, and she said to me, she said, the thing that I find most displeasing about the universe is realizing that for the majority of its life, it will be very boring. That our time and the time of other planets, we are at a time when the planets exist, when the stars exist, when the potential for life exists. And even the fact that we are at an advantageous time, that we're able to understand the expansion of the universe. There will become a point where things will be so distant that there perhaps might be a creature that does not have a night sky, and by not having a night sky, a creature that does not know that the universe is expanding. So all of these things, all of these advantages we have.
Atlas just celebrated its 30th birthday. So that was from the submission of the report that says we'd like to build the detector.
Right.
Was 30 years ago.
Kind of down selected from 2 previous reports, so there was a prehistory even before that. The story, you look back through the conference proceedings, in the 80s, when they were discussing building the tunnel, which had an electron-positron machinery, which is much smaller than this. I mean, still 27-kilometre tunnel, but much smaller detectors and not as many magnets and stuff. There's a discussion there about how wide do you dig the tunnel, what bore do you give the tunnel, and if they built it as cheaply as possible for the electron-positron machine, we'd never have been able to build the Large Hadron Collider. And they chose, and if they wanted to build it so they could be sure they could build the Large Hadron Collider, they'd have had to build it huge and way too expensive. So they did this, a real discussion. Said if you can build the magnets for the Large Hadron Collider in a more integrated way, which we don't know how to do yet, but you've got 10 years to do the R&D, then we'll dig it this wide, we'll build LEP first, and by the time we finish with LEP, we're going to have the Large Hadron Collider to go in, and that's in the 80s. The thing LEP didn't start taking data until 2000. No, 1990. I lost a decade there. 1990 and finished in 2000. And then it took another 10 years before we got high energy data from the LHC. But the vision and the fact that somewhere like CERN can plan that far ahead and spend real money on building a bigger tunnel than you needed for the machine you were going to do definitely next, but to leave open the possibility of doing this later, it's fantastic. So yeah, early 80s is when people were first really seriously thinking about doing this machine.
The fact that every time you find a beautiful scientific idea, things do change for you. And there's like a friend of mine called Clara who's a space archaeologist, which means she uses image-making technology that is taken from satellites in space, which allows her then to investigate archaeological sites. I mean, I was amazed today hearing about, for instance, again, when sometimes people, I'm sure you've had to deal with it, what's the point of all the work you're doing? What's the point? And when I found out, was it muons are used? Yeah, muons being used to examine the interior of pyramids. You know, man, that is fantastic. And that's the thing that I love. Which I wrote a book called The Importance of Being Interested. And the reason I wrote it again was because I've met a lot of people who were worried, firstly, that science wasn't really their thing, and secondly, that science might rob them of things as well. That when we have an understanding, I mean, you all famously know, I'm sure, the Richard Feynman thing about the flower. You know, I got a friend who's an artist, and sometimes he says something I don't agree with too well. He says, when I see a flower, I see the beauty of the flower. But you as a scientist, you pick it apart, and it becomes a dull thing, right? And then Richard Feynman says rather beautifully,
and I think that he's kind of nutty.
Which I love. I love hearing a Nobel Prize winner using terminology like kind of nutty. And then, of course, Richard Feynman takes you on this wonderful trip where he explains all the different levels of understanding the flower, that you can see the beauty, but you can think about why the flower is the colour that it is. Is it that colour to particularly attract insects? If it is to attract certain insects, what does it... I mean, that to me in itself is beautiful. When you look at different flowers and you look at the different creatures that pollinate those flowers, and you realise, like, for instance, a magnolia, that is not pollinated by bees. It is pollinated by an insect that evolved earlier than bees. So that tells us something about the timeline of when that insect evolved, of when that magnolia plant, when that evolved. So that, all of those different things are such beautiful things. And I thought as well about things like religion. Like sometimes people feel that if they have a form of religion, then they can't really get involved in science. They might, but of course I know, and there may well be people here as well, I know quite a few scientists who have different forms of religion. Carlos Frenk, I don't know if any of you know Carlos, based up at Durham University, one of my favourite scientists, and again, someone with a mind far, far greater than I can even imagine having. And I was fascinated when I found out that Carlos believed in God. Because I'd met him on quite a few occasions. We'd never talked about religion before. I was listening to a radio show. I thought, God, Carlos talking about God. I'm sure he means God in that kind of way of Einstein talking about God or Stephen Hawking talking about God. So I rang up Carlos. I said, Carlos, I've just heard you talking about God. I said, what do you mean? He said, I believe in God. I said, like religious God? He said, yeah, I do. I said, wow, I do. He said, yeah, no, I really believe in God. He said, but I should say, I do not allow him into the laboratory, which I loved. That idea of an omniscient deity being told to wait outside must be infuriating. Well, I want to come in. Well, you can't come in, but I'm everywhere. You're not in here. You get in the way of the equations. Yeah. I think only one equation in physics where time is actually part of the equation. That the majority of equations in physics exist in some ways outside time or without time as a reference point. And yet time is ultimately, of course, very, very, when you're then testing some of the ideas that may well exist within an equation, time becomes an important part.
Well,
would that be?
Yes. So it's actually interesting you bring this up because we're testing we're trying to test some fundamental symmetries in what we're doing, right? And as an example of what you're saying, that the equations of physics don't have time, there's a lot of symmetries in nature that are related to that. For instance, let's say you record a movie of the moon going around the Earth, as an abstract example, right? If you show this movie backwards, there is nothing wrong with the physics in this movie, right? So time is not defined. Gravity does not have an arrow of time, right? And you can say the same about if you could film an electron going around a nucleus, the electromagnetic interaction between those two particles, if you want, doesn't have an arrow of time either. The arrow of time comes from thermodynamics. So the fundamental laws of physics, they don't have this arrow of time. Well, some of them do, as it turns out, right? There is an asymmetry, but the overall thing doesn't, right? And it's linked to the symmetry between matter and antimatter, because when you talk about matter and antimatter, how mathematically or how abstractly you will describe how are they related, you relate them through a mirror, if you want. That's called CPT, which is that you swap all the charges, you swap left and right, if you simplify it a little bit, and you've reversed the time direction, okay? So this sounds really silly, but let's say you want to write a mathematical equation for gravity. You don't have to worry about time, right? The equations for gravity does not have time in it because there is no time. It doesn't matter, right? It just shows forces, right? The same for the Coulomb interaction, which is the electric interaction between two charges, right? And also they don't have a left-right asymmetry. It's random which way it's historical artifact, which way the moon goes around the Earth, right? So if you look at a mirror symmetry, it's also mirror symmetric. If you swapped all the charges between the moon and the Earth, meaning all the charges in the nuclei with all the charges, the signs of the charges of the electrons, you also would end up with the same behavior, right? So basically, this symmetry, CPT, is what, mathematically speaking, swaps matter into antimatter.
Everyone here, you may well have sat in this lecture theatre, especially in the early days of working here, and you may well have watched a lecture by someone and had a moment where you've gone, oh, hang on, yeah, oh, I understand it. Yes, I understand it. And then you walked out and you went, oh no, I don't. I did when I was sat there, I'm certain I did, but I got up too quickly and it's fallen out, right? And this is something I heard a lot. I've met various people who went to the lectures of Richard Feynman, and they've said Richard Feynman's gift of explanation was that he would really convince you that you understood that particular idea of quantum electrodynamics, and then you would see the foyer afterwards, and lots of people going, did you think you understood? Yeah, I did too as well. It was a lovely feeling, wasn't it?
So the experiment continues in that direction, and antiprotons from CERN, they come in here through a valve, basically, that's open when we get the antiprotons. We capture them here, and then we can bring them over here, or we can bring them over here, and then we can merge them with the anti-electrons that come from this radioactive source. This is just a very big fat beta plus source, basically. We accumulate them in here, and then we can bring them to either of these two, where we then make the antihydrogen by literally just sort of having two clouds of the species and bringing them together. It has to be very cold for this to work. So we make sure everything is very, very cold with liquid cryogens, for instance. And then once we make the antihydrogen, so that's what unique to our experiment, we trap them, which is what's shown on this video. This shows the inside, where you, as I said, you just have the antiprotons here, you have the anti-electrons here, they're called E plus and P bar, and you just manipulate this potential that's really like a landscape and bring them together. Really very simply in some ways. We've done various versions of this, but this is the version that actually is running now. And then you have a fundamental problem here, which we don't really do anything about. We just have lots of them. Is that to get trapped, you need to lose energy. And the way the positron loses energy to be trapped with an antiproton is it hits another positron, basically. It's like a satellite coming into the solar system. It will leave again unless it hits something like Jupiter, right? And then it's trapped in, basically, this is a sort of illustration of the bathtub magnetic potential that we made. And an antihydrogen can be trapped there, but it's trapped because it has a very tiny magnetic moment. It's a tiny magnet, an atom, but it's really small. So despite this trap being as deep as you can pave your way for magnets, it's only half a Kelvin deep. So it has to be colder than half a degree above absolute zero to be trapped. And then when you throw it away, which is the only way you can see that you have it at the moment, you see it annihilates, and that's what this illustrates, right? It annihilates and you can detect it because all this energy that's stored in it, about a giga electron volt of energy, gets released. And that is relatively, it's not a large amount of energy in any macroscopic sense, but it's large for the detectors, so it's very easy for us to see. So we can actually work with single antiatoms, which if it was atoms would be very hard. Not that this is easy.
I've not looked at the slides, by the way, either. I said this when we were in the canteen. I said, I've not done one of these talks for ages. I'll just find one of the old slideshows that I did from a while ago, and I'll just see what's on it. So the only one that I checked was on it was the brain, and everything else, I've got no idea. That's Samantha Cristoforetti, who I think she's just come back from the International Space Station. She's been up there a couple of times. She uses her time incredibly well and makes these great films and uses lots of different times to alert us to different ideas and understandings of climate change. That is another thing that I love. But like when I meet astronauts, I've never ever stopped being excited. But I think when you stop being excited by meeting astronauts, then there's so much of you that must be dead inside. It's like one of the ones. In fact, I met Charlie Duke, who was amazing. Who actually, incredible thing again. Charlie Duke, his dad was old enough to have actually remembered the Wright brothers' first flight and remembered reading about it in the newspaper as a kid. And his dad was like, Charlie, I can't understand it. I remember reading about the Wright brothers' first flight, and you are going to go and stand on the moon. And he could not believe it. And Charlie said, but my son just went, ha, it's no big deal. And that I love. There was a great documentary series called 13 Minutes to the Moon, and it was, I think, 10 parts, and it was talking to everyone who had been involved in any way. The people who were, you know, whether it was in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, you know, people who were manufacturing the tinfoil that might be required, people who were, you know, all of the... And that's what I always find fascinating looking at a structure like this, is just thinking of the number of hands that are on this structure and the number of minds that are inside and outside this structure, and that kind of the layer upon layer of, you know, the concrete there, and just...
Yeah, I read this, what's his name? It's called Matter Matters or something.
Right.
It's like a book from a guy from, I think he's from one of the London universities, but I've forgotten which one. And he has a whole chapter about concrete, which the first time
is
I read
that Mark Miodovnik? I know the one you're talking about now.
It's really good. It is very exciting. It's surprisingly interesting to read about concrete.
But that's the thing, isn't it? That everything, if you stare at it for long enough, it's like, you know, I've always talked about
always secret.
Charles Darwin's last book is about earthworms.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. We were talking about this earlier on. This is my favourite Charles Darwin book. I own 4 different copies of this. The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms with Observation on Their Habits. Because it is a great example of being inquisitive, being curious, and being curious sometimes for what might initially appear to be no purpose. Because again, something that I think often happens with the communication of science and the way that people are taught science is what can get left out of the education is the daydreaming, is the looking out of the window, is the fact that many great equations that have helped us understand the universe did not start with someone going, oh, I better start understanding the universe today. They start with someone watching the leaves in a breeze. They start with someone watching the twinkling of a star for no other purpose than wonderment or distraction, and then some of that goes inside them. And this was the thing with Darwin. With Darwin, he had spent his life writing the most remarkable books and studies of some of the most exotic and strange creatures on the planet Earth, all manner of peculiar monkeys and orchids. And then his final book, he was walking around his garden in Kent and he started to think about the earthworms beneath his feet and the way that they were moving and aerating the soil, and all of this fascination came through to him, and he started thinking, and he was going like, I'm going to study earthworms, right? And the book has the most beautiful experiments. One of my favorite experiments is he got some earthworms and he got each one and he would play the penny whistle to them to see if they had any kind of, basically, their abilities, their sense of hearing. So he played the penny whistle and he made a note that there was no sign of them being able to hear the penny whistle. But that was not good enough for him. For some of us, we'd go, I checked with the penny whistle, that's it done, earthworms can't hear. But no, he felt that that would not be good science. So then he got his son to come in and play the bassoon to the worms. Still no reaction, so then they took them inside and played the piano to them. That to me is not merely a beautiful experiment, that is also the invention of jazz. So, right, we've just arrived at the CERN Control Centre and I've met Simon. Simon, can I ask you, so what is your official position in the CERN Control Centre?
So I am an accelerator physicist. I'm in the radio frequency group here at CERN. So my job is to study how we actually add energy to the beam, the systems that we use to do that, and the effect they have on the beam, and how the beam responds, and how these two things talk to each other.
But the first thing you told me about was that there is a very exciting pi fact.
Yes.
This was talked about by Steph as well, who's taking us around to go, you must know about the pi fact.
Yes.
So please tell me about the pies.
Okay, so if you look behind you, this is the layout of the accelerator complex. You can see all the different accelerators, all the experimental facilities, and when they were all built. And for the accelerators, there's circumference. And the pi fact is that if we take the PS, which is the oldest accelerator currently running at CERN, built in 1959, it has a circumference of 628 meters. That is a multiple of pi. And the reason they did that was that if you go back to 1959, computing power was practically non-existent or completely non-existent. So if you make your circumference an integer multiple of pi, it means that all the different places where pi appears, so when looking at angles within your machine, it then becomes a function of the circumference, the pi cancels out, and all calculations become so much simpler.
Right. Because the pi fact, he gave me a decoy pi fact of cherry, because I thought when you were saying that, you were actually then going to say that the circumference of this was very similar to the circumference, in fact, almost exactly the same as the circumference of a cherry versus the circumference of an apple, and therefore we could see some sense of... Because I always love that, when apples, like if an apple was the size of an earth, of the, different things about atoms and all that. So we could find that out. We'll find out if there is a cherry and apple fact that we can get in there.
There's probably something you could do. Because you've got, just shy of a kilometre and 27 kilometres. So you're looking at a little over 27 to 1. So maybe a melon and a cherry.
Well, because I think they're important, because you always get this thing, at this point, the universe was about the size of a satsuma. But within, so I think, fruit seems to be a vital part of scientific communication. The legend of an apple and creationists using a banana, of course,
exactly.
as well. So
yes.
That was it. I was mentioning the 100th episode of The Infinite Monkey Cage. And there was this great moment where one of the guests that we had on was Neil deGrasse Tyson. And another guest that we had on was Victor Stock, who is the former Dean of Guildford Cathedral. And Victor is everything you would want from an Anglican priest, right? He is the ultimate example of what the Church of England should be, right? He is polite, inquiring, he's very active in terms of making sure that he helps people who are poor or dejected or without. His notion of God, frankly, is pretty loose, I think. And he also has he has a level of camp that allows him to sometimes pull the rug from under people. So sometimes he'll be talking very much, as the Dean might imagine, and sometimes he'll get a little bit like that, just throw it in. And he'll notice people going, I wasn't expecting the Dean to be like that. And when Neil deGrasse Tyson was on, at one point, because basically we had Victor Stock and a man called Richard Coles, a former reverend, they were in the corner, and we had them, they were called Clergy Corner. And so we would talk about some scientific ideas, and then we go, now it's time to go to Clergy Corner. Now, the first time that happened, there was this great moment where Brian went, well, that was absolutely wonderful explanation of the nature of the Big Bang, but now it's time to go over to Clergy Corner. And Neil deGrasse Tyson went, Clergy Corner? Is there a physics corner in all of their churches? And he just went over to Victor. He went, well, you see, in Westminster Abbey, where we have Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton, and also, of course, now Stephen Hawking, one of the things we try to do with the scientific explanation, and you just saw Neil deGrasse Tyson going, ah! I can crush American Christian zealots, but kindly considerate and wise members of the General Synod, they are my kryptonite. And he shriveled, and it was a great moment because Victor loves all of the ideas of science, but he has found a space as well to place his particular idea of God, which I think is very, very important. Right, we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have a look, and let's just see which slides that we're going to be. I love that so much. Anyone know what that is? It's a piglet squid. You almost see, when you first hear about it, just this kind of complexity somewhere between the game Mousetrap and a bunch of roulette wheels. Boom. Yeah. So what is going on as they start with the lower energy and get to the higher energy?
So the analogy that I use is it's a little bit like if you want to leave your house and get on the motorway. So you don't just walk out of your front door, get in the car and get on the motorway. You go down your driveway, you go along your street, you get onto a dual carriageway, and then you get onto the motorway. And you do that because at every stage you can go a little bit faster and you get up to the top speed to go to wherever you're going. Same sort of idea. So we start with the LINAC, which is the linear accelerator. There's one for protons, there's one for ions. That takes you up to some energy. Then you go into the first of the circular machines, this first synchrotron. For protons, that's the booster, the proton synchrotron booster, and for ions, it's the low energy ion ring. Then you go up energy again, and you get into the proton synchrotron, which is the oldest machine that's currently running that has the 2 pi multiple for circumference. Then you go into the SPS, then you go into the LHC. So at every stage, you're adding some energy so that you can correctly control the beams and get them to be how you want for physics.
Jane Goodall, one of my heroes, what a great person, a fascinating person. The axolotl, the naked mole rat, and I don't know what a lot of these slides were about, actually. Yeah, obviously the blobfish, there we go. The sponge crab, again, this is just such a great thing. The sponge crab, what a great thing of evolution. The sponge crab is basically a crab that if it looks like there's a predator coming towards it, it'll manage to pick up a sponge and just pop it on its head like that. I'm not the sponge you're looking for. You know, it's just such, and I love the imagination of evolution, and I know that's perhaps a wrong way of talking about the imagination of evolution, but I think there's something so beautiful. This was, they're all the pictures on Voyager as well. I might show you, no, you won't be able to hear it, I have no sound. Anyway, sorry, I'll give you all the inner monologue as well, just in case you were wondering. And then obviously I have to ask about the bottles.
So, the bottles, we can go look at them. The bottles are all there to celebrate some significant event. So each one has on it a label that tells you why it's there. And what happens is typically the experiments will achieve some milestone, and then this is a thank you to the mainly to the LHC, but to the accelerator complex in general. So you can see, for example, on this one, this is the first inverse femtobarn in Atlas, I think, from the look of it. So an inverse femtobarn is a very, very, very small unit of area. This goes back to some of the early days of nuclear weapons research, actually, where they wanted to look at what was going on in the nucleus. Particularly, of course, they're interested in uranium for obvious reasons. So they were bombarding it with neutrons to try and figure out what the cross-sectional area of a uranium nucleus was. And what they found is that it was unbelievably big. They could not believe how huge it was. So they said it's as big as a barn. So this gave you the barn as a unit of area, which is 10 to the minus 24 centimeters squared, if memory serves. I need to check that number. So that's a barn. So then if you have one inverse femtobarn, it means that in every 10 to the minus 12 barns of area, you have had one collision.
I'm also glad to see that after what may well have seemed to some people watching an absolutely ridiculous thing for me to in any way bring in Stonehenge, that the summer solstice is there and part of that story. There was when I was playing the Hay Festival a while ago, I had a lovely time there. I can't remember which book I was talking about, and afterwards, as usual, I kind of just hung around. I took questions from people, I was chatting with people, and then as I was leaving, this mother ran up to me and she went, I'm so sorry. My daughter was very, very nervous when you had a group of people around you, but she has a question she'd really like to ask you. Can I bring her over now? I said, of course, bring her over. So she brought over her daughter, who I think was probably about 10 or 11 years old, and she looked quite nervous. She was like, hello, how do I know for sure that I'm not just a character in someone else's dream? It's a good question. It's a question that you look like you could bat away very, very quickly, but once you start giving answers, you find out that those answers do not necessarily bat away the idea of whether we're in a dream or not. So we went bit by bit through all the different questions we could ask and all the different moments of human experience, and this I thought would take 5 minutes, but then it was 10 minutes, and then it was 15, and then it was 20, and then it was 25, and then it was 30 minutes that we spent talking. And at the end of that 30 minutes, I could see that I had predominantly persuaded her that it was more than likely that she was not a character in someone else's dream. But of course, I put so much effort into persuading her that she was not a character in someone else's dream that I started to persuade myself that I probably was, right? So now I'm going through a lot of existential anxiety, obviously. Now, fortunately, the existential anxiety was broken by another child coming up to me. And fortunately, this child was a lot snottier. And this child came up with an enormous amount of chutzpah and just went, I just heard that talk you gave, and actually there was something I wanted to say. Because at one point, you said that the universe might be pointless. And I thought, well, if the universe is pointless, then what is the point in doing science? And I paused, and then I said, well, you do know that it's more than likely that you're just a character in someone else's dream. And that dealt with it. But I love all of that play that you can have. Right, things that didn't get talked about tonight were Tesla. I was going to talk about him. Hedgehog bridges. There's so much. I was going to talk about J.M.W. Turner and the nature of sunset. I was going to talk about a speech by the Bishop of Durham. I was going to talk about British astronauts. That's what I love. One of my favourite things about British astronauts is quite often when you talk to American astronauts and you get the background of why they became astronauts, there's just this fantastic, I had a moment. I was a jet pilot. I saw this star. I thought more and more about the fact that we must journey. We must journey beyond our own planet. We must leave Mother Earth and we must propagate a new path through the universe, right? And you see this great thing. And if you ask British astronauts why they became astronauts, both of them will reply, I saw an advert. And I think that is, I love that. Right, I'm going to tell you a story about Frank Drake, and then I'll do a poem, and then I'll let you go. This again, I'm sure most of you know the Drake equation, if not all of you know the Drake equation. It's a fantastic idea. Frank Drake spent most of his life, the ideas of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence.
Did you at any point see anything where, I was telling someone about, in Jodrell Bank they've had those moments where they go, oh my God, that signal is so specific, it could well be alien intelligence. And then they go, or someone's microwaving their meal next door, and it's actually a madras. Have you, in your experiences, did you ever have any moments where you go, my God, that reading looks absolutely, hang on a minute.
Mostly what I do is analyse the data after the fact. So we've seen things in the data. I mean, if you look, there's the animation of the Higgs discovery, and you look at the points there fluctuating and then recessing to the mean, and we've had many moments where we thought, whoa, what's that point doing? And then in the end, usually they go away, apart from the Higgs.
Right.
So that kind of thing, but not aliens. What they did do, we were mentioning also in the previous accelerator, they did detect a French train strike. Also the TGV return currents from the train magnets were also influencing the beam in the previous collider that was put off. And they noticed the French, they could, without reading the papers, they could, with a small amount of technology, tell the French train drivers had gone on strike. Quite remarkable, isn't it?
And Frank Drake, of course, he'd hoped that in his life we might pick up some signals that really suggested there was some other form of intelligent and curious life in the universe, but as yet we have not picked up those signals. But there was a story that I read about him which I thought summed up, again, the humanity that is vital in an endeavour like that. And that was the fact that when he wasn't looking for extraterrestrial life, he used to volunteer to work at this phone line that would take calls from people who were going through a difficult period in their life, may well be going through depression, suicidal thoughts, or loss, grief, whatever it might be. And I thought, what a beautiful story that is, that here is a human being that is listening out for the possibility of life beyond our planet, but at no time forgetting that there is life on this planet that needs to be listened to too. And of course, Frank died not that long ago, and I thought that is a beautiful way that we must not detach ourselves. As everyone that I've spoken to today, frankly, I saw none of that. The illusion, the cliche of supposed scientific detachment, I didn't see that at all. I saw a great level of humanity in what everyone was doing. And I feel very much that in the last 20 years, which is perhaps, the last 15 is when I've been involved in science communication, that this plays a really important part in terms of re-enchanting the idea. I would say things like Chris Hadfield's films from the International Space Station and images of the magnitude and the complexity and the enormity, and thinking, hang on a minute, this is across 2 countries, and and driving here, and you're looking at cows in the field and pylons up there, and there's a cow's about to be milked, and there's a network of communication which is first of all between the trees themselves, yes, mycorrhizal or mycorrhizal, I can remember how to, and then there's this communication that's happening down here, and that. It feels like this is a really important part of re-enchanting the scientific story.
I think so. I think it's something that I think CERN does really well. I can remember way back when the discovery of the Higgs Boson was announced, the amount of media and public interest in this was amazing. I mean, this is, in some respects, a relatively esoteric bit of high-energy physics that has no direct impact on life, and yet this the way it was presented and made to excite the public was a phenomenal piece of work. I think it's fantastic.
This is another poem that I wrote, and this again was thinking about those kind of nature of the universe and the nature of our place in it. I am disorder. You are entropy. We're a phase of the heat death of the universe made of what might sometimes seem eternal, but it's probably finite, especially when it's gathered up as us. I'm up quarks and down quarks. Am I strange quarks and charm quarks? No, but I'm definitely strange. Leptons and electrons, all together once, compact, rubbing shoulder to shoulder, but before shoulders or thoughts, waiting for gravity, matter and time. We were potential and probability, a maybe with a destiny. But now we're oxygen and sodium, phosphorus and nitrogen, calcium and hydrogen, and a little bit of uranium, assembled by law and equation, but not outside instruction, though some might suggest an Elon Musk simulation. A periodic menagerie, a particle zoo, a bacterial multitude, waiting for our heat death, but currently preoccupied with being alive. At least I think I am. So that, again, I never have no knowledge what I'm going to do. Thank you very much. And so can I thank Steph and everyone else, and Clara and Niels and Simon, and good luck with everything that you do. Thank you. Really hope you enjoyed that. And we've got loads of other new ideas coming up. We've got quite a few things that we've made already, and we've got plans to make a lot more things. And if you can help, it would be great if you could go to patreon.com/cosmicshambles to help fund all of our big ideas and some of our quite small ideas. And if you can't afford to, that's absolutely fine as well. Obviously, we want to make these things as free as possible for as many people as possible. But if you can subscribe, there'll probably be a subscribe thing there or there or there or there. That will be fantastic as well.